no one has gone before.
Konnichiwa, konnichiwa, and yabaseo. Will here of the POLIT'AI CHI. See the quickie slideshow montage, the video highlights coming up. Got Dr. King's niece with some words of advice. Talking about Boston. Kudos to them. And quite a bit of good commentary as to, you know, I'd like to think of Boston. So I got my East Coast support of East Coast police thingling-majing going on here. We continue with the slideshow. A lot of these people ought to be thankful they didn't get charged with battery on a police officer. Judges are not going to find that too kindly. Anyways, it's scrolling through. Boston, as many would look at it as a city, the start of our democracy as we know it. I'd like to think of this as the start of where it began, how to control these types of situations. So they did a great job, and it's a great retrospective. Yeah, different scenes, different types of people there, mostly, you know, counter-protesters. You know, everybody's got the same freedoms for sure, but freedom of choice and questionable judgment seem to go hand in hand. So a lot of these people acting out, bringing attention to themselves in ways, you know, can you take them seriously? Guy shows up in public in a lacy frilly dress. For my part, I'm going to say no. All right. Quickie insert as to the Paul rant. Roll it.
Before you remember in his inaugural speech, President Trump says no matter what color your skin is, no matter what your ethnicity, our blood runs red. Acts 17:26, of one blood, God made all people. So we are human. We're not even separate races. So to come at each other with this angst and anger, it only stirs up the hostility.
All right, so you heard it from her. Heard it from her here first. If I've said it once, I've said it 253 times on this channel, the OMSR, the parent channel to this, the POLIT'AI CHI on YouTube. Part of the reason I think I've got 50% African American subscribers. There is no racism, ethnism, or you're an ethnist. I'm going to send a copy of this off to her. The beautiful, regal, stately, classy, articulate, Sister Dr. King. All right, thanks for watching. Those silly DUIs while you're out there. Something else they're cracking down on over the years. You don't want a first DUI, especially in this state, California. All right, roll clips.
And so the concern, of course, for the city of Boston is they do not want to see any kind of repetition of what we saw in Charlottesville. So the police are out in full force, hundreds of police there on the street today. Dr. Alveda King, whose father, A.D. King, and uncle, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., advocated for peaceful protest, joins me right now. And you know, obviously, Dr. King, we want to see peaceful protests here, but when you have that many people with, it seems, an agenda, do you run some risks?
Absolutely, Trish. The risks are there, but remember the prayer is there also. Now, in the 20th century, I'm 67 years old, and I marched and went to jail. I was arrested, faced bombs and brutality, but I was trained in nonviolent, peaceful conflict resolution by my dad, Reverend A.D. King, my uncle Martin Luther King Jr., my granddaddy, Daddy King, our whole family. So in our legacy, we know that you must have order even in protest, and order is appropriate. And there are 6 steps to that. You gather your information, not fake news, real information. Once you gather your information, you educate your public, and then you examine your own heart and yourself to make sure that you're dealing with righteousness and justice together. Then you sit down and try to negotiate. If you do not negotiate, and this is where we are now in Boston, we've been there in Virginia, the conflict resolution is taken to the streets, but it must be peaceful without the baseball bats and the mace and the sometimes guns and things like that, but you do it peacefully with the goal in mind. It's not just to win your viewpoint, but to reconcile peacefully. And so those are 6 steps of conflict resolution that comes out of the legacy not only of Martin Luther King Jr., our whole family, and our movement of the 20th century.
Dr. King, I wonder how you feel about this right now, because I got to tell you, I'm pretty angry. I don't like identity politics. I don't like it one bit. And I'm going to share with you something that the DNC sent out yesterday in reaction to Steve Bannon's departure. They said, and I quote, "There is one less white supremacist in the White House." And that was followed by Nancy Pelosi saying the Trump administration must purge itself of the remaining white supremacists. In other words, these are very big accusations. And it seems to me at a time like this, I didn't like when President Obama inflared the situation, and I don't like it when Nancy Pelosi and the DNC are inflaming the situation either. I think we're living in a very fragile time, and we've already been down this road. Let's keep moving forward.
Well, we've had this conversation before. You remember in his inaugural speech, President Trump says no matter what color your skin is, no matter what your ethnicity, our blood runs red. Acts 17:26, of one blood, God made all people. So we are human. We're not even separate races. So to come at each other with this angst and anger, it only stirs up the hostility. And, you know, I've got my little book here, America Return to God. Remember that we are human beings. My Uncle Martin said, we must learn to live together as brothers, and I added sisters, or perish as fools. He said, I've decided to stick with love. Hate is too difficult or too great a burden to bear.
These concerns, and they're doing so for political purposes.
Politically making people emotional. I noticed that the President and First Lady are not going to go to the Kennedy Center for the arts program this year, and because they want it to be a beautiful program, they don't want to tear it up with all of the angst and the furor. That's a good attitude, to step back, examine the facts, and do everything that you can to keep peace. And you're right, the alt-right, alt-left are paying people to go in and instigate and stir up. That is certainly true. So we have to be wise here in America and say no. But it's very important that we pray.
All right, Dr. King, thank you very much. You're right. This is a wedge issue, and it's shameful that they keep going back to it. Thank you for being here.
Violence, it's dispersing. Does it come down to the police force?
Well, Melissa, thanks for having me. And I think it absolutely comes down to police presence, right? That is the first step in the use of force continuum, officer presence. And Boston police showed up in mass. They set the groundwork to say, hey, we're not going to have a repeat of what we saw in Charlottesville, what we saw in Durham, North Carolina. They set the law from the beginning, and I commend those officers.
Yeah, I mean, you think that that's essentially what it was about? It was coordination between the police, or is it a different group of people? I mean, obviously in this one, there doesn't appear to be a white supremacist element to it. The speakers there say that they had absolutely no affiliation and disavowed the KKK and any sort of white supremacist. At the same time, there were a few of the same speakers listed that we had seen in Charlottesville. Those are the facts, but it does seem like it was a different event, certainly.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a different event. I mean, you still had Black Lives Matter there. You still had those anti-protesters there, but I think the tone was much different than what we saw in Charlottesville, from the police into the people that actually came to protest. I mean, let's not forget, it is their right to come and protest. It is their right to anti-protest, but I think the tone was entirely different this time.
Yeah. What do you think could have been done differently in Charlottesville? I mean, when you look at what happened, is it the elements that were there? Is it the violence? Or was it the way the situation was handled? Were there not enough police? What's your analysis?
Well, I think that was a powder keg just waiting to explode. You know, whether you had enough police there, no one was taking into account, of course, officer safety. Those police were going to be greatly outnumbered. And then you had a bunch of people that had very different opposing views. And unfortunately, in this country, we're at a point now where people don't think they can disagree with each other without being nonviolent. And it's really sad. But I think Charlottesville, you had a powder keg of people just ready to explode.
Yeah.
We're learning that Boston police will hold a press conference at 4:30 p.m. on the dueling rallies that took place in Boston today. Boston police able to keep the demonstrators apart for the most part. And joining me now by phone is Steve Rogers. He's retired lieutenant detective for the Nutley, New Jersey Police Department here in New Jersey, and a former member of the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, which he is also very well known for. So, Steve, how would you, as we're looking at video right now going on in Boston, we still see that some situations are unfolding there. A lot of people are not going home as peacefully as they should, but the police are there on the scene and handling the situation quite handedly and professionally, and actually making sure that they ensure the peace. We can see some jostling going on there. Tell me what's going on.
Well, to begin with, President Trump was spot on when he tweeted out that the police were tough and smart. meaning that they were very tough from the beginning and made it very clear through a widespread announcements that they were not going to tolerate unlawful activity. And they were smart in that they began addressing the protesters in a soft approach and actually were able to remove any troublemakers that would actually inflame the rest of the crowd. So that's what they're doing. As we're seeing right now, we see the police being tough and smart. They're making it known that they're not going to tolerate unlawful behavior. And if you notice, they're not addressing the entire crowd, but they are addressing those who are potential agitators. So great job, Boston PD.
And let's keep in mind here the famous slogan or credo for Boston, credo if you will, is Boston Strong. We saw how the Boston responded to the terrorist attack that took place there, and the Boston police, as well as the citizens of that city, it was all hands on deck as they looked for those two people who had disrupted that Boston Marathon with a terror attack. So they have a lot of support from the citizens of Boston as well, which of course helps them to have not just the confidence, but the training and the ability to step out and make sure that they keep their city safe.
Kelly, Boston PD made America proud today. As we look at the events around the world, especially in Venezuela, where there is a lot of killing, a lot of fighting in the streets, Boston Police Department made this country proud today by the way they were able to strategically and tactfully deal with a massive, massive crowd. And I would hope that other police departments around the country follow what Boston did today, and no doubt NYPD would have probably done the same thing because they're a great police department also. But when we look at what we're seeing now, the mass amount of people and how the police department, those street cops, those are the ones, the street cops, that should get the credit for the fine job that they're doing.
Absolutely. As we talk about this and watch the video there that's taking place right now there, I'm trying to figure out where that is in Boston. It's likely near the Boston Commons area where they had the event that took place from noon until about 2. It actually ended ahead of time, a few minutes before 2 o'clock, maybe about 15 minutes before they were scheduled to end. But the counter-protesters that we're looking at right there, and we understand that Steve Harrigan had been there as well, following and marching along with or observing the march of the counter-protesters. And he basically said there were a few people in that crowd who were trying to look for something to cause them to act violently, but most of the crowd, he went on to say, it could have been as diverse as women with their children, young men, and older people trying to walk together and show some semblance of peace and denouncing white supremacists. But the conservative group that was there spoke and then left. So it was virtually, at that point in time, there were no clashes except for these skirmishes that we're seeing between police
dude right there
and the
got off with a warning.
protesters.
That's what it looks like. All right, buddy. You've been told.
Should they just go home or just go enjoy
You're
the
walking away,
cuisine
not
of
going
some
to
of the
jail.
Boston,
See you again.
Restaurants?
That's
Absolutely. Look, they made their statement.
it
Time
should
to
be.
go home. You might have some lingering troublemakers who want to inflame the fires.
Lingering becomes muddling.
If you notice the police officers in the yellow, green type vest, I'm sure this is part of the police strategy. Those are probably a lot of community policing officers. No helmets. They're engaging some of the agitators first, and then if the agitators are not falling in line, then you'll see the police officers with the helmets and other equipment come in. So you're right, Kelly. It's time to go home. Look, you made your statement. You go home, relax, enjoy the afternoon. I think what was very, very significant was the police officials letting it be known before the protest today they were not tolerating violence, and it worked.
With our reporters on the ground, it would clearly indicate that the speeches were over.
All right, joining us now is Bernard Shaper. He is a former special agent in charge with the ATF. He is now a faculty associate at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. Sir, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, a lot of people gathering together in Boston today, but it seems to have gone by pretty much without incident.
I would give the credit for today's activities to the Boston police and surrounding community, probably for working with the criminal intelligence information they had and having the resources in place to mitigate potential outbreaks.
Yeah. There were so many people on hand. would you call it how many police do you think, if there were 15,000 people there, what kind of a police response do you need? And also we saw in this case a heavy police presence, but there's always that question about if you have too many out that are armed in riot gear that can provoke violence at the same time. With Charlottesville, lots of people said, they weren't there nearby, they weren't in the riot gear, there weren't enough people, and that's what caused the violence. So how do you deal with that very sensitive balance?
I think past experiences have shown that you have to have a very uniformed, active presence, but you have to have a reserve force that is there to counter violent activities with force, with the maximum level of force needed to knock it down, because these things turn to germinate like a virus. That's what happens in the mob mentality. Additionally, there's going to be a lot of officers and law enforcement personnel that are not in uniform, that are there to gather information and to sense what's happening in the crowds, to get a feeling where particular agitators might be.
All right. We have to go. Thank you so much, Bernard, for joining us.
Largely peaceful demonstrations in which thousands of people flooded the city's streets. Let's bring in Danny Colson, former FBI Deputy Assistant Director and FBI Hostage Rescue Team Commander. Danny, thanks for joining us today. And the first thing I want to ask you is about the way things have gone so far in Boston. How would you describe the Boston Police Department as well as the protesters, the counter-protesters, in terms of making sure they didn't interchange or have any exchanges with the free speech protesters?
Well, I think we have to understand that these things are handled properly by proper training and proper preparation and intelligence. And when you do the things you're supposed to do, like keeping the counter-protesters away from the protesters and having a tremendous show of force. Boston PD is an amazing police department. They're one of the most professional in the country. I think that's reflective today. And I think also the fact that recently a couple of people were arrested for doing things in a public setting. That's kind of a deterring thing, and nobody wants to go to jail. So if you're a protester and you're bent on violence, you come there and see wall-to-wall cops, and you can tell they're professional and disciplined, then you're going to be a good boy or a good girl, I think.
A good point. I want to point out something the president tweeted about today's protest. He says, quote, "Looks like many anti-police agitators in Boston. Police are looking tough and smart. Thank you." It does require some smartness and being tough and being able to let people know we're here, we're going to protect your right to free speech, but we're also going to make sure that we ensure the peace.
Well, free speech doesn't guarantee criminality. You can't. You can demonstrate.
Yes,
you can't go out and riot and hurt people or get at gang fights. You can't do that. And I think that when you have a professional department that looks like Darth Vader, they look tough and imposing, then people behave. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good lesson to be learned here.
Danny Colson, thank you for your service to the FBI, and thank you for coming on and sharing.
The Boston Free Speech Rally did wrap up earlier this afternoon. The speakers there were deemed hate speakers by city and state officials, and that's why this had such a counter-protest that poured out to push back against what many people felt would be hate speech coming from that bandstand here in the Boston Common earlier today. The speakers and that rally ended very early this afternoon, and they were forced, the attendees at that rally, the speakers were forced to be escorted off of the Boston Common by the Boston police, which had wagons there ready to take them out because they were literally surrounded by the counter-protesters and vastly outnumbered by those counter-protesters. More than 10,000 people streaming onto the Boston Common today. Many of the counter-protesters held signs that said no KKK, no white supremacy, signs for peace, signs for love. When in fact the Boston rally folks, the free speech rally folks, denied having anything to do with the KKK or white supremacy. Now, one of the reasons they drew so much attention is that one of the speakers that they had intended to have speaking today at their rally also spoke at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, that speaker did not attend today's rally, but there were some other controversial speakers, and there was a large effort, a lot of Black Lives Matter folks, a lot of progressive organizations, a lot of activity on the web to pull in this huge crowd, some of them marching from across the city and finally ending here on the Boston Common. Right now, there's still a big police presence here in the city of Boston. You can see some of the officers here on their bikes. These have been very useful. They've been moving about, responding to any skirmishes that might have popped up. And there were a few skirmishes out there today. There were some folks with various political opinions that differ from one another, the minority opinions, in this case the conservative opinions, some folks that had some Trump regalia on, for instance, were often surrounded, being shouted at by those counter-protests as they worked to move across the Common today. But ultimately, it was largely non-violent. The Boston police did make some 27 arrests, but for the most part, those were for disturbing the peace types of things and also attacking officers. Now, we did get word later on in this afternoon that some of the elements, not the counter-protesters and not those that attended that free speech rally, but another element of people that Boston police were ready for and aware could be here, just pure troublemakers, did stay behind afterwards, were throwing things at police, rocks, bodily fluids, and now even that crowd has largely dispersed. So calm once again, returning to the streets of Boston. Arthel?
Yeah, largely nonviolent. I'm sure, Molly, most of us can say we're very happy that that is the case. Molly Lyon, thank you so much. Leland?
Well, as Molly reported, the right-wing protesters were vastly outnumbered by counter-protesters who are just now starting to disperse after thousands of them took to Boston streets to counter today's conservative rally. Of course, all of this framed by the deadly violence at last weekend's alt-right rally in Charlottesville. Steve Harrigan on the ground for us in the Boston Common as well. Steve, give us...
Leland, first about the numbers, just hearing from the police commissioner, 40,000 total demonstrators out of the streets today. They really filled those streets from start to finish, 10 to 15 city blocks going strong. So about of those 40,000, perhaps 39,900 were those counter protesters. Of the different groups, there was a real mix out on the streets of young people, old people, men, women, all different races, many carrying signs in their hands, anti-Nazi, anti-President Trump. Largely peaceful, though, throughout the day. A lot of them chanting. But the police commissioner said there were three different groups out here today. There were the free speech demonstrators, there were the counter demonstrators, and there were troublemakers. Those troublemakers were a small number, perhaps fewer than 100. There were some scuffles with police. We did see some of the counter demonstrators in masks and in helmets. Police have complained about having objects thrown at them, including bottles of urine. Throughout the day, just 27 arrests when you're talking about 40,000 demonstrators. Most of those arrests for disorderly conduct, some for assaults as well, 2 or 3 skirmishes, a few of them here in the park. But the major confrontation that people feared could happen after Charlottesville did not happen here. Police said that's what we wanted to avoid. That's what the mayor said. That's what the police commissioner said. We wanted to avoid that violence. And by keeping the two groups apart, by separating them, they were largely able to do that. Leland, back to you.
Well, they were able to do that. This from the Boston Police's Twitter page. BPD is asking individuals to refrain from throwing urine, bottles, and other harmful projectiles at our